Welcome to the Solano Subbasin GSP Community Advisory Committee. It's June 1st, 2021. Nothing else for the sake of the recording. And we are going to be looking at, amongst many other things, the undesirable results and sustainable management criteria today. So one moment. The goals for today's meeting is to support CAC members and any observers that are here to understand the Solano Subbasin groundwater conditions and how this relates to developing sustainable management criteria. And if you're not familiar with some of these terms, sustainable management criteria or undesirable results, we will unpack those as we go. We'd love to get CAC feedback on qualitative aspects of undesirable results and why you think and what you think that significant and reasonable should mean. Again, we'll unpack all of these things and support us CAC members and observers to have the information that you need to give meaningful feedback on the GSP sections. There's 3 and 4 are coming up, or I think have just been released, and more are coming. So we want to be able to give you all the information you need to give input. Okay, and just a quick overview of the agenda as we dive in, and you can keep putting in the chat as folks, I think I just saw somebody else join, but maybe not, as you're listening in the background, anything you're excited to do this summer. The agenda for tonight is we'll start with just a really brief check-in in a moment, and then Vicki is going to offer some presentation on first the Solano Subbasin groundwater characterization. Then we'll be looking at sustainable management criteria, trying to define undesirable results. What are the things we're wanting to avoid for the Solano Subbasin? And we'll have some breakout groups then. And then going into projects and management actions that are being proposed right now in order to avoid the undesirable results. We'll look at some next steps, and then we'll have time at the very end for observer reflections and Q&A. Although at this point, particularly with this number of folks, I don't even see, yeah, if you're an observer, you're welcome to chime in as we go. And then we'll close. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. This is just a friendly reminder that we're going to focus the discussion on the GSP development. Invite you, if there's anything that would support you to stay more present, minimizing windows, silencing phones. I'm a chronic multitasker, so if that's happening, I understand. And as much energy as you can bring to this, it helps the discussion, and we really want to hear from you all. Listen generously, speak candidly and concisely. We really want to know what's on your mind, and so feel free to bring that. And with this small of a group, we can be a little less than concise, but again, just being mindful of everyone's participation. And as always, want you to ask as many questions as you've got. And we'll be, if you have a burning question, it's not sort of the time for Q&A. If Vicki's in the middle of a presentation, you can raise your hand if it's really burning and struggling to stay present, and Vicki, we can try to interrupt you. Otherwise, the real invitation is to put it in the chat, and we've got experts on standby, Chris and Nick and others, who will be monitoring the chat to get your questions there. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to invite, I'm just going to show this slide of these are 6 undesirable results, and you might not have heard of these before. Some of you might be familiar, but just when you hear chronic lowering of groundwater levels, these are things that where Sigma's mandating that we avoid, and reduction of groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, water quality degradation, land subsidence, depletion of surface water. Again, you might not know what all of these things are. We're going to get into them in much more depth, but would love to know in the chat, which undesirable result do you have the most questions about? Or are you maybe the most stumped on, or most hoping that we dive into today? So I'll go back to the other screen, but if you can put in the chat which undesirable result you have the most questions about. So again, those are chronic lowering of groundwater levels, reduction of groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, water quality degradation, land subsidence, and depletion of surface water. Let's give y'all a few moments. And oh, great. I'm seeing also some fun responses in the chat to the, what do you want to do this summer? Okay. Yeah, great. Depletion of surface water. Thanks, Stephen. Ditto to that. If there are others, would love to hear. It's okay if you have a different one that you're most curious about. And this can be a CAC members if you're here as a CAC member, or observers. We really welcome from both of you. Curious if I'm going to stop my share. That's helpful. If Mike or Roberta, if other folks have any chronic lowering groundwater. Yeah. Great. And Roberta, if it's hard, if you're on the iPad, you can say it verbally too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, it was, I accidentally had, when I turned it on, turned my picture away. So I was just my biggest worries and interests are in chronic lowering of groundwater and water quality degradation.
Great. Thank you. Noted. Okay. All right, we're going to hold those and keep those in mind, and we may be able to go into a little bit more depth, but again, we're going to cover all of these. It's just really helpful for us to know what you guys are coming in with, what questions or sort of focus areas. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Vicki.
Great, thanks, Amy. Let's see.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for attending this meeting this afternoon. We, especially right on the heels of the holiday. As Amy mentioned, there's a few things that we're going to talk about today. In this first part, before we break for a poll, we're going to have a brief refresher of some key terms that relate to the subjects tonight. And then we're going to do an overall status of the groundwater basin conditions. And this is what most, if not all of you have heard before, but we're going to do a refresher in the context of the importance of defining the undesirable results. And then we're going to talk about the undesirable results, some example definitions from a qualitative perspective. And then lastly, we're going to circle back on projects and management actions that we dabbled in last time, but we're going to talk a little bit more about what's occurred since. So with the GSP development, there's 4 main sections. You've seen this slide before. We've been focusing a lot on describing basin conditions, and this has included the preparation of 3 technical memorandums. We've also been working on the completion of the local Solano Subbasin integrated hydrologic model that Nick Watterson talked about last time. And we've been receiving input from the Solano Collaborative on projects and management actions that we'll talk more about today. So on a couple of these key terms, the essence of Sigma is really captured within these 2 terms. The sustainability goal, it's really one that's crafted within the GSP to describe how the plan is going to achieve sustainable groundwater management by implementing measures to ensure that the basin is operated within the sustainable yield. So that sounds a little bit circular. So we also need to define sustainable yield as the most important term. So this being the maximum quantity of water calculated over a base period, representative of long-term conditions in the basin and including any temporary surplus that can be withdrawn annually without causing an undesirable result. So this is a really key linkage between the term sustainable yield, that's the essence of the GSP, and what's to be accomplished in the subbasin, and that it also needs to avoid undesirable results. So Amy just previewed this slide, and we have undesirable result, really referring to one or more of these 6 things that could be caused by groundwater conditions occurring throughout the subbasin. So it's not about a very localized place. It's not about a specific parcel. It's more throughout the basin. And it includes those things that are significant and unreasonable, 2 terms that GSP regulations do not define for us. So we are particularly seeking input from the CAC and stakeholders on the definitions, what that means to you. So we're going to come to that a little bit later. So that occurs in relation to all 6 of these things: the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, the reduction of groundwater storage, groundwater quality degradation, saltwater intrusion, land subsidence, and stream flow depletion. And given that we're in very dry year and drought conditions being the top of the news on most days, note that groundwater storage reduction during a period of drought is not sufficient to establish a chronic lowering of groundwater levels in and of itself. However, the GSAs must ensure that extractions and groundwater recharge are managed as necessary to ensure that reductions in groundwater levels or storage during a period of drought are subsequently offset by increases in groundwater levels or storage during other periods. Otherwise, we do need to take into account those effects. So these are images on this slide are examples of undesirable results that are occurring in other groundwater basins. None of these apply to this subbasin. These are images that are mostly associated with the basins that are in a critically overdrafted state, and they're associated with very poor groundwater conditions for each of the 6 sustainability indicators. So you can see just visually, the impact of lowered groundwater levels, not a lot of water to recharge the system, resulting also in groundwater storage. That color on the groundwater storage slide is related to depths to groundwater and losses of storage. Seawater intrusion colored to show the extent of chloride, moving inward in response to the changes in the interface between saltwater and freshwater, degraded water quality, land subsidence causing structural damage, and depletion of interconnected streams. So showing a very dry stream bed in this case. So as we go forward, we're going to do a quick discussion of what we've been working on in sections 3 and 4. These draft sections have been provided to the collaborative. Essentially, they're preceded by both the technical memorandum on the preliminary surface water system water budget that we've talked about in previous meetings. There's also the large technical memorandum on the hydrogeologic conceptual model and groundwater conditions. And with these 2 technical documents, then they provide the basis for more synthesized sections. The draft section 3, which is the basin setting, and appended to it are actually 2 technical memorandums, one on the hydrogeologic conceptual model and groundwater conditions, and the other on surface water and groundwater interaction. That section 3 goes into the hydrogeology in a more synthesized way, the monitoring networks and surface water and groundwater connections. Draft section 4 covers the historical, current, and also projected water supplies for a 50-year horizon. It includes information on the population trends and land uses. At this time, we have a placeholder for part of the projected information. Part of it has come from input received from the GSA collaborative, but part of it will also be informed by the 50-year future modeling scenarios once those are completed. So the next slides, a lot of these are going to be looking very familiar to you, but as I mentioned, we're wanting to do this refresher to have it be on the top of your mind as we dive into the discussion of, what are the basin conditions in Solano Subbasin currently, and how do they relate to what we're working to define in the way of undesirable results, which we don't think exists today. But what we do want to know, what is it that we are trying to avoid, and how do we go about avoiding those in the future? So the hydrogeologic conceptual model technical memorandum included numerous geologic cross sections, 15 of them shown at all the locations on this map, some of these extending to depths of almost a half a mile or more. And the main purpose of this being to characterize all the conditions within the subbasin and to heavily rely upon that as we were developing the physical basis for the integrated hydrologic model. The shallow aquifers in the groundwater basin, when the Solano project came online, it played a very large role in the use of surface water. So we described earlier about how that related to the change in groundwater levels from, a sort of a declining trend in some cases to then there's a marked increase in groundwater levels when the project came online, and then stable water levels since that time with some slight variations, when drought periods occurred. But as we've mentioned previously to this committee, there are some exceptions, notably in the far western, north to far western portion of the subbasin. And that will become an important thing that we'll focus on this afternoon. The deeper groundwater levels, groundwater pumping in the deeper part of the system had increased in the mid-1970s. This pumping occurs under very confined conditions, meaning these sediments are under pressure from which the groundwater is pumped from. And what we've seen when we've compared water levels in the shallower part of the system to the water levels pumped in the deeper part of the system is that there's generally not any influence between the pumping occurring in the deeper deposits to those that are where groundwater is produced from shallower sediments. The deeper production south of Vacaville in the South Vacaville area occurred until about 2000, and then new groundwater development was extended into the northern Solano Subbasin area, and that stabilized a condition. Water levels declined because it was new development, and then that condition stabilized in about 2010, and groundwater levels, generally speaking, in the northern part, in the deeper part of the system, have been stable since. However, we're going to look now at a few specific hydrographs in this northwestern part of the Solano Subbasin. These are hydrographs for wells that are completed in the upper and middle Tehama formations of the groundwater system. And these wells typically range in depth from about 100 feet to 400 feet. And for many of these wells, we've seen groundwater level declines that have become apparent since about 2010. It's been a period when many dry years have occurred with fewer instances of wetter years. So in more recent years, there's been some recovery that's occurred. But again, last year and especially this year, we're facing back-to-back very dry years. Recovery has not occurred for all of the wells that have been monitored in this area, and especially not the well that we're showing here. I'm in the middle panel on the left side of the image. This is a well that's primarily completed in the deeper Tehama formation, and particularly noteworthy is that it's near the perimeter, the far boundary of the subbasin up against the hillsides. So as we look at this slide, we're now showing a difference in groundwater levels. This is the difference between groundwater levels that were measured in spring of 1988 to spring of 2018. And over this 30-year period, we're seeing that much of the subbasin has shown little change or even some increases in groundwater levels, where it's the light tan to purple color. However, as we talked about in the last slide, there is an area, particularly in the northwestern portion of the subbasin, that sort of medium brownish color that is showing a decrease in groundwater levels as we look at the comparison between the beginning of that period and the ending of that period. So this is an area that we're going to circle back to as we talk about projects and management actions especially. There's just one slide I was going to show here that kind of captures all of the preliminary surface water system water budget and results. As you may recall, the data is for the period from 1991 to 2017. And this was used to compute the early part of the water budget for the Solano Subbasin. So not the entirety of the water budget will be which is going to be covered by the integrated hydrologic model that we are completing calibration on. So with the earlier water budget work, we compiled the land use and water use data to refine the hydrologic model as well as for the preliminary water system water budget. And this is being used to compute the historical, the current, and then with the model, also the projected water budgets for the entire groundwater and surface water system. So one of the things that we're tracking in addition to water level trends are measurements to track the elevation of the land surface. And this is fundamental to monitoring whether there are changes in potential land displacement or land subsidence. So satellite data are collected. These are from continuous global positioning systems, measurements taken continually, and other technologies that are also used to measure the land surface elevation changes. Here we're showing the data collected from these stations and displayed over time. A little bit shorter record for the Vacaville station from 2012 to 2020, but we're seeing an overall land surface elevation change of in the thousandths of a foot per year. This is a very, very small change. Similarly, the P267 station, it's a little bit more central in the northerly part of the subbasin, data collected over a bit longer period from 2005 to 2020. And it's showing a change of a very small change, but slightly more so than the Vacaville station. Overall, these are very small changes. They do show a decrease in the land surface elevation, but this is not necessarily, at this point in time, we're not necessarily classifying it as an inelastic or permanent land surface displacement. Moving to groundwater quality, these are data for nitrate and TDS. There's a number of different parameters that we've summarized in the technical memorandum on hydrogeologic conceptual model and groundwater conditions. Nitrate having a state drinking water limit of 10 milligrams per liter as nitrate nitrogen to be safe for drinking. This image is showing where nitrate and also TDS have been measured in the wells in the subbasin, and the concentrations are being shown for the maximum values within the records for the wells at these locations. There are a number of wells that do show nitrate levels that are exceeding the standard for nitrate, but most of the wells that we have on this image are below that standard. There are a number of locations in the northeastern part of the Solano Subbasin that are particularly showing where there's an exceedance of the drinking water limit. On the total dissolved solids, or TDS, the recommended standard is set based on aesthetic concerns for taste, and that's a level of 500 milligrams per liter. Most of the wells in the Solano Subbasin have TDS concentrations that are lower than 750, which is below the upper and the short-term standards, which are 1,000 and 1,500 milligrams per liter, respectively. We are showing some wells that are exceeding that 750 milligram per liter, and they're the wells in the orange and red colors. Moving to other aspects related to our discussion of sustainability indicators. This is a map that we showed previously to highlight, the importance of other beneficial users. It's not just the people in the subbasin that are very important. It's also the plants and animals and the natural communities that rely on groundwater to meet all or a portion of their water needs. And these ecologic communities are all collectively termed groundwater dependent ecosystems. This map of critical habitat from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service shows key areas in the subbasin that are important habitats to support the fish and the vegetation and other animals. As many of you know, California Department of Fish and Wildlife is a key stakeholder during the GSP development process. especially to ensure the needs of fish and wildlife are met. And as some of you are aware and have participated in, a subset of this committee has met previously to discuss historical studies and other mapping efforts that are really important to understanding the surface water and groundwater connections in the Solano Subbasin. As we move forward, this is a map of the groundwater depth in the subbasin, and also to the north in the Yolo Subbasin. This is for the spring 2018 timeframe, and this is showing for the upper part of the groundwater system, representing the alluvium and the upper zone of the Tehama Formation. The color scheme here shows that depths of groundwater for 2018 spring are relatively shallow over most of the area, with somewhat greater depths occurring at winters. And then as you see the lightened colors as we move west of winters in the direction of the hillside and outside the subbasin, the depths increase. We have shallower depths to groundwater in the northeast of Dixon area, that blue and purple color showing quite shallow depths, and also west to the Dixon area. These are important as we circle back later and talk about, where we're trying to focus interest for projects and management actions to ensure that undesirable results, don't become an issue in areas where groundwater levels have been lowered and need attention. We're also showing on this map along Poudre Creek, different color bands. We have historically identified conditions on Poudre Creek that include losing reaches. Those are the brown color in the vicinity of Winters, and again, west of Davis. There's a gaining reach, receiving groundwater from the groundwater system, a green color, the center of the image. And then transitioning conditions are shown in the purple color, where sometimes it can be a gaining reach or a losing reach, depending upon what's occurring in the system. This last slide before we pause for a moment, it's basically taking a health check on the Solano Subbasin. We put together this summary of the sustainability indicators in the far left column, and the description of the sustainability indicators that we talked about early on. And then to describe, what we consider to be the current status or health of the groundwater conditions in the subbasin. There's a variety of things that are kind of moving between good to, quite good. There are areas where we feel like there's always room for further information and more enhanced understanding of conditions with additional data. But overall, groundwater management actions have not seen what we would consider a contribution to any groundwater quality or other degradation. Things like groundwater quality conditions that I mentioned where there's exceedances, those are pre-existing conditions that are not the role of the GSAs to correct, but they are something to pay attention to as GSAs and the stakeholders look at ideas and in the future implement projects or management actions. We do want to ensure that we are not exacerbating existing conditions by the action of projects or management actions. So with that, I'm going to pause, and I think Amy has a poll.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Vicki. And we'll also open it up to some questions in just a moment. But just hearing all of that, this is similar to the first question, but a little bit different. And this just helps us to gauge what you're concerned about. So which undesirable result are you most concerned about based on what Vicki just shared? And if you have questions that you need to have answered before you're able to answer that, let us know, and we can keep the poll open while you ask your question. And just observers, please feel free to participate. While folks are responding, I just want to remind, if you've just joined us, if you're a CAC member, if you could rename yourself and put CAC before your name. And if you need help with that, let us know. And if you're an observer, you could just put OBS observer before your name. That just helps us when we get to the breakout rooms. If you're a GSA member, you can also put GSA before your name. Okay, I'm going to close this in just a few seconds. Which undesirable result are you most concerned about? All right, and the results, the chronic lowering of groundwater levels is the winner, or maybe the loser. It's hard to say which one in this case. And the reduction of groundwater storage is also pretty high up there, and water quality degradation. So this is great information for the technical team and for those of us helping to craft the GSP and focus on things. This is great information just to know what those in the Solano Subbasin are really concerned about. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that. So just want to open it up. There's another round of presentations and slides coming in just a moment, but before we bring more information to you, we want to give you a chance to digest it. If there's any questions or even reflections based on what you're hearing, would love to open it up to CAC members. And again, it's a pretty small group, so if you're an observer here, please feel free to chime in with a question as well.
This is Stephen. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please, Stephen. Thanks.
And you can hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you. And I just want to remind, I just saw Roberta ask one in the chat, which is perfect. And I'm just pinging Nick and Chris and others from the team to answer that in the chat while others ask it verbally. Okay, go ahead, Stephen.
The northwest corner, I know some people who live up in that area, and they'd complain about wells going dry, and also it's certainly an issue there. Is there some obvious reason? Is it just too many straws in the same drink, or is there? I was wondering particularly if they're out of the area that's influenced by the Solano project, so they don't get the benefit of leaky canals and whatever, and over irrigation. Is that part of it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Stephen, and it's one that we're still looking at. Our ideas today about factors contributing include all the things that you mentioned. So it could be that there's some, close proximity of some of the rural water users, like private wells within more confined, part of the sediments, and close proximity may be impacting one another in a, if they're kind of densely located in a rural area. There could be changes in land use also that are, turning more to hardened tree crop, use, or new land use up in that area. Some that we've looked at are actually outside of the subbasin, so they're in the more consolidated formation materials. And some are up against the edge of the basin. So there may be some deposits that have some productivity, but part of their well is completed in deeper deposits, that they're more consolidated and lower permeability, deeper water levels, as they are stressed by losing some of the water that's up in the shallower deposits. So we've looked at information along with the YOLO Subbasin folks to some extent. We're trying to, share data across the subbasin boundaries, and also with the integrated hydrologic model and some of the things that we'll be looking at, that may also help inform, what we're seeing in response to what.
I've got a bunch more questions because I was asked to have a lot of questions, but I'll listen. You can get to others.
Great. Those are great questions. Thanks. We'll come back to you if others are shy, but don't be shy. And Roberta, you're asking some great questions in the chat about who gets water from Lake Berryessa and how much goes to city versus rural. And thanks for answering those, Chris. Others, does anybody else have a question about undesirable results or other aspects of what Vicky's sharing? Yeah, Ben, please.
Well, I noticed that depletion of interconnected surface waters overall looks good. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on the needs more data part of that?
Sure. We actually, at at this time, there's a lot of historical data from different kinds of wells. There was a recognition of a need for more focused and dedicated monitoring. So on Poudre Creek, for instance, which is what I'm discussing right now, there are seepage monitoring wells that were installed at 4 locations with multiple monitoring wells at each of those locations. And that was in collaboration with UCD. And we were trying to get those wells installed ahead of what we had hoped would be a rainy season, which didn't really occur. So some of the response of the aquifer system that we were hoping to track, with time as different things occurred, we've seen a tiny bit of that, but not as much as we'd hoped because of the limited number of more significant rain events last fall and into the winter. We're trying to look at, with the limited data that we have on hand, what is responding to local pumping, what is responding to releases, when there's water being released from the project and down Poudre Creek in accordance with the Poudre Creek Accord. The other thing that we are working on now, and I think in the next couple of weeks or so, we are arranging a meeting with DWR to move forward with technical services support application that DWR had approved a year ago in June, but they had the Solano Subbasin in queue to recognizing that they wouldn't be able to move, any of the drilling equipment out to install monitoring wells until this year. So we're preparing to do site visits with the department to proceed with the installation of dedicated Sigma monitoring wells at 5 locations along Poudre Creek. We've also discussed with the department, the opportunity to try and mirror that on the north side of Poudre Creek in the Yolo Subbasin, but that would really need to come as an application from the Yolo Subbasin GSAs. Yeah. So we have seen a lot of information, over the years. It's historically been collected. We see with the Poudre Creek situation, it's a little bit different because there's a required release of water into the system. So some of the groundwater dependent ecosystems that rely on water, to meet their requirements, their needs, that's also being accomplished through the release, with the Accord. But we still want to see, where is their connectivity? How is that connectivity affected by groundwater pumping, locally? So that's where the more information will still be useful, and the dedicated Sigma monitoring wells that are, close to being, moved forward with the installation, those will be extremely helpful to have more of an ongoing, certain record associated with those monitoring wells.
Thanks, Vicki. Great questions, Ben. We have time for probably one more question just in this round. I want to make space if anybody else has a burning one, otherwise I'll pass it to Stephen, but happy to hear a new voice if there is a new question. All right, Stephen, it's all you.
Thank you. No, actually I had 2, but they're both related to the change in land levels, I guess. It was interesting that it's a consistent downward trend and that it's sort of sinusoidal. What are the drivers of that? I mean, even though it's a small amount, it's consistent. If we're looking at a 50-year horizon, a small number for 50 years ends up being something, right? So it seems like we still ought to understand that and be sure that it's elastic, not inelastic.
Right. Well, I'll start, and then I think it'd be good if Nick, if you add on. One of the other things that we're looking at is where there are these PBO, CGPS stations that are located also outside of the subbasin, and also the INSAR data that is more continuous across the subbasin. So in some of the stations that are located outside the subbasin, those are helpful because we're also seeing the difference in loading, unloading, just of, what's occurring with the hydrology and the loading from additional water in the system. And so some of those downward trends and the sinusoidal effects, they can also be due to other just geologic, movement in the subsurface. So we're very much trying to collect the information and understand the information that distinguishes what is attributable to groundwater extraction versus other processes.
Okay. Yeah. All right, and could I ask one other question? Or you want to add to that?
It'd be good if Nick maybe added on to
Well,
that.
I guess I think the one thing that, some of the best data that we have, as Vicki mentions, those GPS monitoring locations. And those are, real high resolution, high quality monitoring, but they're in a broader temporal scheme of things, they're somewhat more recent. So I think the oldest one went in 2005. Is that right, Vicki?
I think even a little bit later than that.
Maybe even a little bit later. And so when you look at the long-term hydrograph of what's happened over that period, it's been a generally dry trending period relative to the longer term average. And so I think there is a little bit of, we'll have to see what happens, and if there's, if there's some amount of rebound as things start to, recover. And then there's, I think, like as Vicki said, there's a lot of, it's challenging just to figure out what's elastic versus inelastic, not to mention what's caused by, the compaction of the clay versus other effects that may be going on that are changing the vertical elevation of the land surface. But it's a good point that, if even a small amount can translate to large amounts over a long period of time, and something to keep an eye on, is, but also kind of keep it in the context of what is, you look at seasonally, we see fluctuations that are on the order of, the seasonal fluctuation and variability is significantly larger than what we're seeing over the long term. And so we know that vertically it's moving quite a bit interannually. And so that's another thing to just keep in mind.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Vicki. I think just for the sake of time, we'll move on, unless your other one's really burning, Steven. Is that okay? You can always toss it into the chat and Nick can help you there. Otherwise, write it down and we'll have another moment, because I'm sure it's a good question that adds a lot of learning for folks. Okay, Vicki, I'm going to pass it back to you, I think is what's next. Yep.
Okay. So in this next set of slides, we're going to turn to examples for undesirable results. As we mentioned, that these are definitions that we're wanting or needing to create. So these are framed up by the GSP regulations, but the specifics of the definitions are really left to the stakeholders and the GSAs. So there are qualitative aspects to the undesirable results definitions, and there's also quantitative aspects to these definitions. We're mostly going to provide examples of the qualitative aspects of these definitions in the next handful of slides. And the quantitative aspects of the definitions, those are really informed by first of all, how we frame up the qualitative parts of these definitions, but also the model information helps to provide information on the sustainable management criteria, those that are the metrics or more quantitative component. So the first one, in the Community Advisory Committee's package, there was a memo about the sustainable management criteria framework. And there were some examples. And in these next slides, we're just going to go through these so that they're top of mind for this group as we dive into breakout discussion a little bit later. So on the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, would become significant and unreasonable. And for example, if conditions in the Solano Subbasin result in prolonged or ongoing year after year reductions in groundwater levels, and particularly below levels that were recorded historically. This, as I mentioned earlier, would generally exclude groundwater level declines that are occurring during drought conditions. However, it's something that the GSAs will want to closely watch, because they're going to want to be able to adapt, you know, and manage according to what may be, you know, changes in climate year sequences, the way drought years are occurring, the way precipitation is occurring, all of those factors. It's something to be watched closely, you know, through time as to when those drought years occur and how they occur, and to ensure that there's a means to recharge the aquifer system after those drought years, you know, have gone. Moving to the reductions of groundwater storage, these would become significant and unreasonable if groundwater conditions in the subbasin result in the removal of storage or reduction in it, and exceeding the subbasin sustainable yield. So that means that we've had this, essentially it ties to also the chronic lowering of groundwater levels. We have declines occurring. It means we're using more of that groundwater that was in storage than we are able to replenish over a long period of time. And in doing so, we can trigger undesirable results. And again, this would exclude drought years, but only with the caveats that I just mentioned. For land subsidence, an example of where this would become significant and unreasonable is if groundwater conditions, you know, result in, you know, a removal of that groundwater to the extent that permanent inelastic subsidence occurs that disrupts or causes, you know, accelerated damage to really important infrastructure, both public and private. All kinds of different infrastructure could be also pipelines, waterways, you know, things to pay attention to. Typically, when we're looking ahead at how this would be defined for quantitative criteria, we're not wanting to wait until it gets to the point of that extreme sort of damage. So as we think about this, we'd also be wanting to set other means of describing, you know, how that would be tracked, what criteria would be set, so that there's at least a trigger before it ever got to the kinds of results that we would put into the category of being significant and unreasonable. So we move to the avoidance of degraded water quality. The example here is where it could become significant and unreasonable if, as a result of projects and management actions undertaken in the subbasin by the GSAs, that water quality is changing and it no longer meets state or federal standards, or it also, separate from that, if it begins to negatively affect the suitability of groundwater for beneficial uses. So it may be that there's some constituents that they don't have a set standard, but there could be other parameters that affect whether or not, you know, that water quality remains suitable. So typically, this is something that it's not in the purview of the GSAs to remediate a contaminated site, for instance. That's under the purview of the regulatory agency that oversees, you know, whatever the situation is. So if it's an underground storage tank, a dry cleaner operation, a hazardous waste site of other kinds of constituents, those are not the direct purview of the GSA. However, it is within the GSA's responsibility to be attentive to where projects and management actions might be implemented, and that the actions that they undertake don't cause the mobilization or spreading by any kind of contaminated site. And then as we look to the sustainability indicator for depletions of interconnected surface water, examples of when this could become significant and unreasonable as a result of groundwater extraction is if the depletions through groundwater pumping affect the timing and duration of that hydraulic connection between groundwater and surface water, and if they're reduced relative to what may have already occurred historically. That means that the GSAs are not in a position, like for the critically overdrafted basins in the San Joaquin Valley, if there's been no hydraulic connection for decades, it is not within the purview of the GSAs to have to create conditions that reconnect those parts of the system. However, where there is a connection, and it's within a relatively recent period of time, you know, relating to the implementation of the Act and GSPs, that there is a need to pay attention to what those connections, you know, have looked like and should be. Another aspect of it is to look at the volume of surface water flowing in the groundwater system as a result of groundwater extraction and use. And if that is depleted relative to what may have occurred historically, and where there are stream systems where seasonally flows are low typically, and there is that connectivity, and if increased groundwater pumping has resulted in a further reduction of those already low flows, then that is a significant and unreasonable result of groundwater extraction. So as we move into discussion of these were just examples. It's really helpful to the technical team to hear from the committee and observers and the whole group about, you know, what are we trying to frame up in our mind that, and in the GSP, that we are able to define the qualitative aspect of what is undesirable. It's those things that we don't want to have happen. And the quantitative part will be how we measure it to ensure that it does not happen, that effect is avoided. And it helps us to know, you know, what are we aiming at? Because we're needing to know when we have completed the water budgets, including with the integrated hydrologic model and looking out 50 years in time, including with climate scenarios, we're needing to know what amount of water, you know, that we might need to be identifying to replenish the groundwater system, and where it needs to go, how it needs to occur, when it needs to occur, what kind of quantities. So it's very helpful to know how we're defining these undesirable results as we go about, you know, defining what our water budget looks like now and in the future. And also circling back on our definition early this evening is the sustainable yield. A key piece of that, in order to achieve sustainable yield, we must avoid undesirable results. So with that, Amy, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Vicki. Okay, so we are going to break up into a couple of breakout groups just to support a bit more discussion. And Lupe's got those queued up. Vicki, as she's showing those discussion questions, and we've got a few more that the facilitators of the breakout rooms will also walk you through. And I'm just, as a heads up, we're splitting up project team members, so the folks from the technical team and GSA collaborative members. We're just putting you in the two breakout rooms. You're there as a support, answer questions otherwise. So the breakout rooms might look quite large, but actually we're prioritizing hearing from CAC members and observers. And so GSA members and technical team, you're sort of there as experts to help answer questions. And before we dive in, there's a 530-601-1489 number. I just want to see, I'm gonna ask you to unmute who that is, just so we make sure where to put you.
It's John Hopkins, Institute for Ecological Health.
Okay, great. Thanks. Hi, John. Glad you're here.
Hi. Sorry I was late.
That's okay. We're just glad you're here. Okay. And I see another call-in user. I'm thinking that Jack, are you also here on the phone? We might merge your video and your audio. Jack Keekler, is that you on the phone? I think it might be. Okay. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, is that you?
It is me.
Okay.
And I'll probably be calling back in from a different number after the breakout session.
Okay, that's all right.
Great hearing.
We'll put you in that one. Yeah, we've merged your phone and video. Okay, great. All right, folks, thanks for bearing with us. So we're gonna send you off. Lupe, feel free to open up the breakout rooms. Before we dive in, how about this? Are there any burning questions that you'd like to ask now? Again, there will be technical experts, but either about the breakout rooms or to Vicky in this moment. Want to make sure. Okay, great. So then Lupe, open up the rooms and we will be back. Oh, that will be helpful for me to say. We'll be back in 20 minutes and Lupe will give a 5-minute warning and you've got 5 minutes left. And then if you each breakout room, if you could just, if you have the time, if you remember to have maybe pick someone to do a quick, really brief report out of some of the themes that you're hearing. Otherwise the facilitators can do it. That's one of the things that we'll do in the breakout rooms. Okay, now third time's a charm. Lupe, open those babies up.
Sorry, Jack, I don't know if you saw that there was a countdown, but I think we ended your comment right when your sentence ended. So that was good.
We did.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jack. And thanks to everyone who participated in the work groups, breakout groups. They're like work groups. I'm going to actually invite, just for the sake of ease, Genevieve and Susanna, just to give a really brief recap, mostly just for the sake of the other group and have some information flow. So Genevieve, do you want to just offer a couple highlights from your group?
Yeah, we talked kind of about larger concerns, like there was a theme around limiting regulation and really prioritizing farming over housing in terms of how water was made available. And so, and there was also just some good question and answer around that, like how is water prioritized between water and farming and housing in Solano, in the Solano Subbasin. I think another piece was wanting, there's a sense that because we're talking about undesirable results, we're talking about it feels more reactive. So we did talk about some of the more proactive measures that were being taken in the plan around projects and management actions that both would be in place if an undesirable result were to occur, and also would help keep us from hitting those undesirable results. So that was a lot of the conversation, very rich dialogue, and my apologies to John Hopkins for not getting him in. We ran out of time. So John, if you have anything else that you wanted to add, feel free to put it in by chat or send me an email. We'll make sure it's in the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Genevieve. Yeah, Susanna.
Great. Yeah, ours was also a really rich discussion. Really appreciate everyone's input. Active participation from our group. And I would say the main themes that I heard were around, really not knowing what the scenarios will be in the future, given climate change and other factors, really considering this an ongoing process of adaptive management. And so not setting it in stone, but continuing to check on what does it mean to be unreasonable and significant here. And then there was also a number of comments around, sort of not having this be a one size fits all situation. And as much as we can, speaking to the monitoring network that we'll be creating around the sustainable management criteria, and also the different areas within the subbasin, looking at what management actions would be needed for those specific areas to treat particular issues that might come up. And then the last thing I would say is that there was a couple strong comments good comments around like how the fee structure created might affect, if there's an undesirable result happening in one area of the basin and there's a management action or project that's created to address that, how we work with paying for that and having the benefits sort of accrued in one area, but the full subbasin is funding that. So, and some concern there. So I would say, you know, there was a number of different areas that we got into, and it was, I'm really grateful for the comments that were made.
Thanks, Susanna. Yeah, it's great to hear a recap from both groups. I think particularly highlighting the very purpose of this committee and just getting the questions, getting the concerns, what's on people's minds. It really does help to shape what the technical team both puts in the GSP, how we focus research and the for us as the team that will be writing up the public engagement pieces. Really, your input matters a lot. So before we transition, we actually are unbelievably ahead of schedule, which I don't know, I'm going to give us one of these because it almost never happens. We're often behind. So with our extra 4 minutes, I want to just make a space for other questions before we head into the next sections on projects and management actions. So there might be lots of questions and interest about that, particularly at least from the subgroup that, or the work breakout group. So many synonyms for that I was in. That I think that there'll be a lot of interest in where we're heading. And I want to see if there's any questions for Vicky or the team before we head over there. Could probably take 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, and this might be a good time since I didn't get to John earlier. If there was,
Great.
John, if you
Love
wanted
that
to
idea.
add anything.
Hmm?
You'll have to unmute yourself though. There we are.
Hi, this is a very interesting discussion that we had in our group, and I was particularly mindful of the need for agriculture to have sufficient water. I do think we have to be mindful of the sort of current medium and long-term situation. I was reading last week about how an article by scientists about how here in the sort of southwestern United States, we're in the worst mega droughts for hundreds of years, and it could go on for a lot longer. It has already been going on for not just a 1-year drought, it's been going on for quite a few years here in California. You know, we had 1 or 2 wet years, but I think like in the past 10, maybe only 1, 2 at the most. And it's very likely that things will get a lot worse in terms of rain and snow. So the idea of a laissez-faire attitude and avoiding government in regulation, while you know, it would be ideal, but with less and less water and the need to not have precipitous reductions in groundwater over the years, I think we can't have the luxury of being laissez-faire.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's a similar sentiment that we heard in our breakout group, just about how are we adapting to the climate change and the extreme events that we might be seeing, and how are those being taken into consideration as this plan in the present day gets created when there's just maybe more uncertainty, or we're really present to the amount of uncertainty that we're living with. And so I wonder if Vicky or others just want to speak to that just a little bit again in this moment, to bring that sentiment back in. There was discussion of adaptive management and how do we flow with the changes that are coming. And maybe that's, Vicky, if that is the perfect segue into projects and management actions, you can take us there too.
It is, but I'll just say that, I mean, I think those are really insightful comments, because I think it's worthwhile to look at what is DWR serving up in the way of recommendations at this point in time for climate scenarios. How does that relate to cumulative departure analysis of the hydrology that we've already experienced, but in the latter part of that hydrology, we're already seeing a shift. And so do we need to think further about, you know, how we're representing the 50 years into the future? So this GSP, I think Susanna, you mentioned in our group, you know, this is kind of an infinite process. It's not going to end with the submittal of the GSP. And my sense from, you know, what I've observed of all the participants, the GSAs and this group stakeholders, that it won't be, you know, put it on a shelf and come back around in 5 years to meet the next requirement. It will be an ongoing, continually tracking and keeping up on things and being nimble, you know, with what needs to occur in order to be adaptive.
Great. Oh, there's really loud cars outside my window. Thanks, Vicki. I'll let you keep going. I think we're back on to the minute. So if you want to start with the projects and management.
Yeah, I'm going to switch screens here. Does everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Great. So on the projects and management actions, we talked about this at the last meeting. We're going to do a handful of slides. This is something that we've been discussing with the GSA Collaborative for a number of meetings, and we've given the collaborative cycles of homework and requests to provide, you know, feedback to us about potential projects management actions. So altogether, there's probably dozens of, you know, ideas, really, you know, great ideas, and they range from best management practices for agricultural operations, so more broadly applicable. Some are probably things that lots of entities are already doing, you know, within the subbasin of their own accord. There's continued interest in conservation, things like that. So as we worked with the collaborative, we kept on trying to fine tune, you know, those projects that would rise to the top, that were of the most interest, particularly with respect to integrating them within the future modeling scenarios, so that we could evaluate, okay, if we do have, you know, an issue going on, you know, how is this approach, you know, potentially going to buffer or mitigate the effect of, you know, a drought year or years that we're experiencing. So I just wanted to bring back, you know, a slide to refresh. There are a number of explicit requirements in the GSP regulations that need to be represented within the GSP, at least for, you know, key projects that have this level of detail. So, and other ones can still be recognized, but not necessarily with the same level of detail. But we're wanting to acknowledge, you know, that there may be many tools in the toolbox, but there are a couple that we particularly dove into, and we did some initial analyses, you know, using them in modeling scenarios. So some of the requirements in the regulations include a description of how these projects management actions, you know, shortened to PMAs, would achieve the sustainability goal, and how they'd be used to respond to conditions if we see them changing, and if we see trending in one or more areas in the direction of undesirable results. We need to have some kind of description of required permitting or regulatory processes that may be related to the implementation of the projects or management actions, how they would be implemented, what kind of timetable. Some things, if it involves infrastructure, even meaning utilizing existing infrastructure, but, you know, managing it in a way that is economically and both cost effective and purpose effective, that there may be a timetable associated with actually implementing that needs to be thought about before you need to use it. A description of what kind of benefits, you know, we expect to occur as a result of implementing projects and management actions, how they would be accomplished, you know, what would trigger the implementation, and how would it occur. Some things might roll out in a phased approach, other things maybe it's all at once. What kind of legal authorities may apply, what kind of estimated costs are associated with these projects or management actions. My understanding is DWR is not looking for a very detailed cost estimate, but they're trying to get a sense of, what are the GSAs recognizing that they may need to commit to in order to implement the project or management action. And then most importantly, how would they achieve what we're hoping they achieve if they need to be implemented, and that's the long-term sustainability. So in this slide that we've illustrated before, the recharge areas, so the green areas on this map of the subbasin being those that are more conducive to recharge, and those that are orange or red being less conducive to potential recharge. And this map is really more of the near the land surface representation from some of the research done some years ago now at UC Davis. We're currently working with the Freshwater Trust, and Ben Wallace is in the meeting tonight. We're looking at some other aspects of potential recharge opportunities, including the deeper part of the groundwater system, some of the historical data that we've collected through the hydrogeologic conceptual model, and also the groundwater conditions, in order to be further informed about, what might be the areas of potential interest for recharge opportunities. That was one of the things that was particularly high on the list for the GSA collaborative. How might surplus stormwater be captured and held or retained on the landscape, utilized to try and accomplish some amount of recharge in those years, that are wetter than others. So, and we're also trying to look at existing conveyance. How does that line up with the areas that we're thinking would be good targets for potential recharge opportunities? We're trying to look at ways that could be cost savings, more efficient, potentially utilizing existing infrastructure. And then circling back on the map that we showed earlier on groundwater levels, and particularly the decline over the longer period of time in the northwestern part of the subbasin, we were considering this to be a focus area. It's an area that's coming to our attention as needing a little bit deeper dive, especially when we're getting input from the collaborative, and we'll hear from the committee and the observers in a moment. We're looking to know, how can we implement some of these things to address areas like, this northwesterly area. So storm flows or flood flows, when they're available, recognizing, when those periods have occurred historically, what kind of water may be available, not over planning for something that, may not occur. But it also need to consider, who are the landowners? Are they amenable to what we might have in mind? Would there potentially be detrimental effects, or how can these kinds of projects be designed or developed to account for those kinds of concerns or issues when we're thinking about retaining surplus water on the landscape? So at this point, we're really looking for some additional input from the committee and the observers and those on this call.
Thanks, Vicki. And maybe just keep that slide up for a little while, at least while we get started. And we're not going to break up into subgroups for this one. I just want to open it up. First, if there are questions, as always, clarifying questions for Vicki or the technical team, and you can always put those in the chat as well. Or just your input for what types of actions do you think would be beneficial to avoid undesirable results, and what would be the biggest obstacles to implementing potential management actions. Really happy to hear from anybody. I think we'll, just for the sake of time, prioritize CAC members first and then open it up to observers. So CAC members, any thoughts? Yeah, Elizabeth, love to hear from you.
So being a small farmer ourselves and using sustainable, practices, I realize that there are a lot of things that farmers can do to keep the water the rainwater and recharge the groundwater. And so I know those things are probably what you guys have been looking at. And my question would be, is there a talk or ideas of how to help farmers implement those practices? You know, helping with funding some of those practices. And, you know, I mean, I'm just curious about that. If there's any help that you guys see that could be given to farmers.
That's a very good question. And I believe maybe after there's some more discussion of the committee that we were actually, correct me if this is not correct, Amy, but I think we were going to see a couple of slides from Ben Wallace at the Freshwater Trust. So there are things that the technical team on this investigation of recharge in areas where there's potential for recharge opportunities. Ben's going to show a few slides of some things that may be tools to help the farmers directly look at some opportunities on their own, properties and their own, parcels. So there's the combination of, smaller things that add up to a larger thing, in scale, if there's a lot of things going on across the subbasin. And then there may be some other opportunities where we're trying to look at, a larger scale that involves, more properties than any one landowner might be looking at.
Okay.
Yeah. And it may be one other thing on the funding. So there is, my understanding is DWR next year, there will be some funding for implementation of GSP elements. So one of the things that we've heard from DWR is important to do is to incorporate the kinds of projects or management actions in the GSP, however they might be recognized, that those have a better chance of being in the eligible category for pursuing grant funding than if they're, nowhere in sight.
Okay.
Thanks, Vicki. Thanks for that question, Elizabeth. It's a great question. And yes, we'll come to Ben in just a few minutes to hear from a few more resources. Other questions or feedback? Yeah, Stephen.
In terms of actions, there's a physical and then the management ones, right? So in the management sort of arena, is part of the thinking to have some sort of crediting program? So say some farmer does something like Elizabeth was talking about, they enhance the groundwater. That groundwater is going to seep out to them and their neighbors. And do they get some extra credit, so to speak, so they're able to withdraw some of that water that they specifically added, or any other crediting mechanisms like that?
So at this point in time, there has been discussion. One of our team members is Duncan McEwen of ERA. He's an economist, and he's brought presentations to the collaborative relating to water markets or other kinds of systems that would consider those kinds of things. We have in mind at this point, because the GSP on the time frame that we're on, which is really relatively short, to get the completed document all together, to get it posted, public review, input, boards, GSA boards adopted, and submit to DWR. So in order to have some kind of credit system or water market, any kind of trading system fleshed out, would be a little bit longer task, in order to figure out how that would actually work and be implemented. So the plan at this moment is that we would have a discussion at a higher level of that process within the GSP, but not the details of it at this moment in time. But it is something that is of interest, and I think we will plan to bring it back to the collaborative more in an educational kind of discussion. However, we could also think about bringing that to the committee too, if that's of interest.
Thanks, Vicki. Great question, Stephen. Others? And I'm seeing some notes from Ben and Chris in the chat. Any other questions or feedback around projects and management actions, what you'd like to see, types of actions you think would be beneficial to avoid undesirable results or obstacles to implementation?
Roberta.
Yeah, great.
Oh, I just had a question. So I asked some questions about Lake Berryessa earlier, and some of the answers were that that project had contracts that are 60+ years old. And so my question is, can any of that be revisited for people in northern Vacaville, northern Solano County, as a means of using some of the surface water and not sacrificing as much of the groundwater, being that we're in one of the areas where it's very hard to recharge the groundwater? And so who would you have to go to do that? Would it be, you know, the federal government would have to make new contracts like with SID, or how does that work?
Mm-hmm. I wonder if that's, yeah, either Vicky or Chris. Oh, you're on mute, Chris.
Chris, you're.
Well, that was a very short answer then.
Yes.
The short answer is it would be very difficult to do something like that, Roberta. We have existing contracts. The Solano County Water Agency, who I work for, is the local entity that has the contract with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And then we have subcontracts with irrigation districts and the cities here in Solano County. And that water is pretty much spoken for. And we can't open up the contracts at this point to look at including a different district like rural North Vacaville Water District into, as it wasn't contemplated in the original area of origin, the scope of the project. It's a monumental task to do something like that. And I think that what Vicky has alluded to, these projects and management actions at looking at other local ways to move the water around when it's available and get it to places where we are seeing some troubling spots, is going to be probably the short and long-term solution, and probably easier to do. Again, giving local support and landowner cooperation where it's needed and wanted. And so the short answer is no. It'd be very difficult to do something like that at this point. But I can certainly talk to my general manager and see what his thoughts are on that.
On the one more bit of that is, since the water is coming down through Pewter Creek, is there a possibility for people that are trying to do ag in the northern half, having water from Pewter Creek? Technically, it's still the water from Lake Berryessa, but it's now moved into the creek. And how would that affect like the areas on the creek, since they're able to recharge?
Sure. So for landowners that actually are adjacent to Pewter Creek, they have riparian water rights, and they do have the right to use that water for the agricultural purposes. And part of the Pewter Creek Accord, which was alluded to earlier, takes that into account. And that's how we know to release more water downstream, so those farmers and the fish and the birds and all the other groundwater dependent ecosystems adjacent to the creek have enough water available for all of those beneficial use and all of those beneficial users.
But all the way down to North Vacaville, coming from, further down, I'm talking about moving all the way down to like English Hills, and I guess Pleasance Valley already has the right for that. But what about having it extend out to English Hills for ag?
Yeah, that's a different topic for discussion, and a big task to try to overcome.
Thanks, Roberta. Great questions. I see your hand up too, Brett. We'll take you, and then maybe we'll have time for one more before moving on. Go ahead, Brett.
Just thought I wanted to throw out on your question there, Roberta. I think to the extent that there were surface rights that were otherwise unexercised, there may be a potential, maybe there's lack of conduits or the delivery systems available, but there may be some potential to deliver that water via the surface when it's in excess in Pewter Creek, and or have in lieu credits for groundwater use. So, I mean, if somebody were otherwise relying on groundwater, but there was some exercise surface right there, you might be able to deliver that surface water when Puda Creek was in excess, and then you could maybe the GSA could get credit for that as an in lieu usage of groundwater. I don't know if that's possible.
Vicky or Chris, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, if you really want to get into the weeds, there's something going on right now called voluntary settlement agreements, and kind of what Brett was talking at. One of the things that the water agency is actually talking with the state right now, the State Water Board, Cal Fish and Wildlife, and Bureau of Reclamation, is actually doing what Brett just said, is potentially releasing some additional water through different canals in different parts of Solano County that will make itself out into the Delta to freshen up some of those areas, provide additional habitat for endangered species like Delta smelt, but also providing additional benefit of groundwater recharge along the way. So there is the thinking along that, and it's something the water agency is seriously looking into to help as best we can, with also preserving, all of the water rights and allocations that we already have under contract. So we are certainly looking into that, but we are slightly constrained in how much water we can release at certain times.
Is there anything more you would want to add? Okay, so Ben, we're going to pass it over to you just so you can discuss some of the resources you wanted to share.
Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little teaser on some of the things that the Freshwater Trust is working on. And my main reason for doing this is we don't have a lot of time here, but we're hoping to organize a workshop in a month or so where we can talk about some of the tools that we're developing to support the local GSP and other GSPs that we work with. And primarily that includes a web map, a scenario planning tool, and a groundwater marketplace website. Which goes a little bit to the questions folks were asking earlier about groundwater accounting and trading. So just to give you a little glimpse of what that looks like. Okay, so the Freshwater Trust role in the planning process for the Solano GSP right now is supporting and looking at potential management actions relating to how farmers in the subbasin can do voluntary groundwater beneficial practices and have incentives to do that, and have it kind of build into a sustainable model for agriculture in the subbasin. And some of the practices that we're looking at are cover crops, irrigation upgrades, what we call AgMar, which is a form of managed aquifer recharge, and RainMar, which is a stormwater-based form of managed aquifer recharge. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but our analyses lead to 3 different products that I could share with you at a future meeting. And so what I'd like to do is we're planning to organize a workshop in the future in which we would share with you our web map, a scenario planning tool, and also a website that we're developing. It's a conceptual website for a groundwater marketplace, a groundwater trading marketplace. And so I'm going to go to a couple different places here. In brief, the web map, let me get rid of myself. There we are. The web map is a tool that you can use to search the databases that we're using. And it's basically a simplified geographic information system tool that you can use to look up different types of data relating to publicly available data sets about the agriculture that's happening and opportunities to do voluntary groundwater beneficial practices. So that's one, is the web map. Another one is what we call our Solano Agricultural Scenario Planning System. And essentially what this does is it allows you to use that same data to customize programs. For example, a groundwater sustainability agency could use this data to develop a program to figure out where are the best places to do groundwater recharge, for example, and how can we set up a program to incentivize those types of practices. And I could go through this. There's a whole bunch of inputs that you can put in to come back with quantitative data on where you can basically optimize groundwater recharge on farms, or irrigation efficiency, for example. And then lastly, we've been developing with another client, we've been developing a website that is kind of a hypothetical groundwater marketplace in order to work out the details of groundwater crediting and what and to start to think about what is the world going to look like if when we are in a place where there could be groundwater trading that would where farmers could manage their groundwater in a flexible way through trading programs and whatnot. And so we've been developing a system to kind of allow groundwater well information to be communicated to satellites and put into a password protected, highly protected website where actual groundwater trading could take place, and it would be managed by a groundwater sustainability agency that is essentially the administrator of that market. So I'm basically letting you know that these things exist, and we would like to set up a workshop, and I'd be delighted to find out if members of the GSA would be interested in learning more about these things. And the idea of the workshop is not to just present information, but to kind of give some presentation and then actually let you use some of these tools to see how they work, to test the quality of the data in them and give us feedback on how we can make these tools better. So that's what I wanted to share, and I would be delighted to get any feedback you might have in the Q&A section that I know will be following.
Ben. And why don't we just, I think just for the sake of ease, we'll go into that piece now just to have folks respond. And so I'm hearing that you're wondering if people would be interested in attending some of these workshops, just gauging interest. Folks could either raise your physical hand or your electronic hand if that's something that interests you, and just to give Ben some visual feedback would be great. So I'm seeing several, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm interested. There's some in the chat too. So is that giving you a sense, Ben?
Cool. Yeah, that's great. I appreciate
great.
it.
Is there any other?
Feel free to follow up with questions if anybody had a question for me. Go ahead.
Yeah. Does anybody have a question for Ben? We can go there. We've got a couple minutes. Okay. You can throw them in the chat if you do. I'm going to just, right before we close, I am going to launch another poll. And so we just want to make sure that you guys are, a lot of this is geared, one of the ways I'd say is to support feedback on the GSP itself. And so I'm going to launch a poll. Have you offered feedback on the GSP sections? That's the first question. And I know it's almost 6 o'clock on the button. If you have to go right away, totally understand. I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next 45 seconds. Great. And if you want to throw it in the chat too, but it looks like 12 of you have responded. If anybody else wants to respond, it looks like, okay, I'm going to end a poll in a couple seconds. Have you offered feedback? Okay, so it looks like 7 have and 5 haven't. That's great information. Okay, so the next polling question is, if you have, or I guess even moving forward, whether or not you have, how prepared do you feel to offer feedback on GSP sections moving forward? So I don't feel prepared at all. I feel somewhat prepared. I feel prepared, but could use some more information. I feel extremely prepared. And again, this is so that we can target what we're offering, and whether it's to meet with you one-on-one or how we structure these events to support you to offer feedback in that way as well. This is one way to offer feedback, coming to these live events, and then also through the GSP feedback, written comments. Okay, there's 10 of you, 12 of you, great. Maybe just a couple more seconds if anybody else wants to weigh in. And the poll now. Okay, so many of you could feel prepared but could use some more information. A couple of you feel prepared or extremely prepared, and somewhat. Okay, so this is great information. And the last one is launch poll. Would it be helpful to provide a demonstration of how to provide feedback? Is what's blocking you that you just simply don't know how? That would be also really helpful. Great. Okay. Some yes, some no. Okay, I think that's all of you who are voting. So 7 said yes, 5 said no. This is really helpful. So I think for the sake of today, we've tried to show in previous ones, we're thinking about maybe making little video clips and sending that out and walking people through it that way. So if you are struggling, you can reach out to us individually through email. And Lupe, if you could just throw some of our emails in the chat, mine and Suzanne. Well, I guess, yeah, we'll start with mine. Let's start with mine. So I'll field them. Best to have one source, and then we'll pass you on to the right person. So if you do want one-on-one support, let us know. Otherwise, we'll send out some instructions.
And I'll just say, just to clarify that really quickly, if you want support around not just how to physically comment on the GSP, but there's specific information that you're looking for more to feel prepared, please also feel free to email and we'll send you to the right sources.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Susanna. Good point. The last thing, if in the chat before you go, if there are subjects that you think we should cover in order to help you offer meaningful feedback, just like Susanna's saying, if you have ideas right now, please share those in the chat or over email. Any other suggestions for how we can help you and your neighbors and community members provide meaningful feedback to the GSP. So we're always trying to get input for what's the best way to reach out to people so that they can feel informed, actually to address the concerns that you had, Brett, of what are we going to do when we're not able to care for all the needs. This is one of our attempts to really make sure we're hearing from the different stakeholders. We really want to care for all the needs out there. So if you have suggestions for the best way for us to do that, please, again, in the chat or since we're about to close, through email. That's always another way. And Lupe, if you could post the feedback form, that'll be the last thing in the chat. You can give feedback on this this meeting, either process and or content, and that's also another place to throw in any of these ideas, these last minute ones that I'm packing in at the very end. So we were ahead of schedule and now we're 3 minutes behind. So anyways, I appreciate you sticking in there for the last 3 minutes. The next CAC meeting will likely be in September. We'll send out some scheduling polls in the next coming weeks. Stay tuned for those. Hope you all have a lovely summer. Stay cool out there. Stay safe.